Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Personalizing Healthcare with Digital Technologies. My name is Sydney Perlmutter, and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Verisense, who developed the content for this presentation. Verisense Health provides clinical data collection services through its digital health panel and data from its digital biobank. Verisense Health is a spin-off of Shimmer Research, a leading manufacturer of wearable sensors for clinical, academic, and consumer research. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Arthur Combs is a physician executive with more than 20 years of experience in clinical practice and 20 more in the medical device industry. He has served as Executive VP of R&D for a Fortune 500 company and as CMO of 4 successful medical device startup companies. For the past 7 years, Dr. Combs has focused his energies on the wearables, real-world data, and digital biomarker space. Notably, he served as CMO of MC10 Inc., a wearable device and digital measures company from 2016 until their acquisition in 2020. He has been a lifelong contributor to the peer-reviewed literature, including recent publications in digital biomarkers. He is a sought-after symposium presenter on the topic of the clinical imperative for digital biomarkers. Dr. Combs has extensive clinical research experience through collaborations with the pharmaceutical industry, academia, and technology companies. Stephen Smith is co-founder and director of Clear Sky Medical Diagnostics Limited. Incorporated in 2013, Clear Sky markets a portfolio of CE-marked, clinically validated medical devices that assist in the diagnosis and monitoring of patients with Parkinson's disease and related conditions. Dr. Smith developed the underlying biologically inspired white box machine learning algorithms that power these devices to provide a quick, safe, and reliable means of assessment both in the hospital, clinic, and patients' homes. Dr. Smith is also a professor of electronic engineering at the University of York in the UK, a fellow of the British Computer Society, and a past Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Fellow. And Jeff Gill is currently the founder and CEO of Verisense Health, Inc. He has spent the last 15 years overseeing the acquisition and analysis of wearable sensor data, most recently as the president of Shimmer Americas, where he was responsible for Shimmer's businesses in clinical trials and consumer neuroscience. Before Shimmer, he was the Senior Vice President of Operations at Interscope Research, where he oversaw the conduct of approximately 700 consumer neuroscience studies involving over 100,000 participants using wearable sensors. He has also led the development of blood, gas, and electrolyte sensors as VP of R&D at Bayer Diagnostics. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand the presentation over to Jeff and our other speakers. So you may begin when ready.
Hi, I'm glad everyone can make it. I'm really excited about the webinar here because we have, I think, a very diverse and interesting combination of people. We have Art Combs, who is a doctor and obviously a lot of experience in medical devices. We have Stephen Smith, who's a expert in machine learning and AI, but who's also developed medical devices. And I've got a little bit of experience on the practitioner side in terms of actually executing studies. So I'd actually like to start by asking Art, the title of this webinar is Personalizing Healthcare Using Digital Technologies. Perhaps you can, describe what we actually mean by that, or what you think of when we talk about that.
Thank you, Jeff. Since I've been in the wearable space and looking at continuous data, digital biomarkers, digital endpoints for trials, etc., I've had two real epiphanies. The first one is that all diseases are systemic diseases. If you look for how the patient is acclimating to a particular disease, you will find it in every aspect. For example, if you look at their heart rate variability, you will find out the status of their autonomic nervous system and how it's acclimating to having a disease or a condition. If you do a sleep study, you'll find out the unique way in which either the pain of the disease or the disability of the disease or the activity of the disease has affected their sleep patterns. It affects vital signs, and it'll affect certain things that indicate function, like step count or activity levels. So the first thing I realized is that even if you think your disease is isolated, let's say I have arthritis in my knee, if you look with continuous digital data monitoring, you will find that it has affected the autonomic nervous system, the patient's sleep cycle, their activity level, and their day-to-day functioning. So that's an opportunity to personalize. Second is, I hate to say it since I've been a doctor for almost 50 years, we've kind of been doing it wrong. I think all doctors believe that they give personalized healthcare. You come into the office, I take your blood pressure, I listen to your lungs, I watch you walk. I am personally giving you healthcare, and I write you a prescription, and I give you some advice, etc. The problem is, one, that is a singular point in time. Number two, it's an artificial point in time. This is not what you're usually doing all day, every day. Number three, it's artificial in that you may be invested in the communication. Some people like to minimize their symptoms. Some people like to emphasize their symptoms. Some people are looking for some kind of reward. Some people are looking for a cure. You don't know what's going on with them in their real life. When you send them home, perhaps with a wearable sensor, you start to find out, how do they sleep? How active are they? How do they walk? Do they have a gait disturbance? How are they acclimating to being overweight or being diabetic or having osteoarthritis? So the opportunity of observing functional abilities, how people feel, function, and survive, is the real life that takes place in a personal way between doctor visits. And so I think the idea of intermittently assessing people at one point in time and then again months later is an outdated model of healthcare. And personalizing is going to involve understanding how people feel, function, and survive under ordinary circumstances.
Oh, I'm certainly agree with that. But Stephen, you have things to add or a different perspective?
Certainly, yes. And I think what's really interesting on what Arthur said is from a clinical point of view, Art's observations, and this ties in very well in how we've taken an approach to digitizing patients' behavior. So I'm probably quite well known for helping diagnose and monitor people with Parkinson's disease. But what we actually do is we just measure movement. And not only can we say something about the movement as a sign or a symptom, so most people who are familiar with Parkinson's are probably aware of the tremor that you might often see or a slowness of movement. And so it's the movement that we are measuring to help us interpret the patient's condition. But even more than that, in other related neurodegenerative conditions, which are typically not classed as movement disorders, so other conditions such as mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's, we found that actually by measuring movement, we can also infer cognitive decline. So this really follows on very much with what Art is saying. By very careful observation of people's behavior, people's movement, we can tell so much more than you might immediately think. So I think this is really the way forward. And kind of, it really makes sense. So when we see our friends or family, we can always tell when somebody's not really on top form, if they're not really feeling well. We can see it in the way they move. They don't move as much. They might be more sluggish, or they might be overactive. But there are all these hints in the way that people are moving, I think, can help us in this assessment.
Yeah, no, I really like the point that you both have made, that you may not see direct correlations, or you might not think that there are direct correlations between these various conditions and some of the other attributes you might measure. I mean, I often make the comment that, look, if an illness doesn't impact someone's activity or sleep, are they really ill? You know, because they're so fundamental, and there's so many things like that. So I think I might add a couple points in terms of the way I think of personalized medicine and digital health. The first one is that fundamentally the variations in people's signatures, digital signatures, are so wide that you have to use a person as their own control. I can give an example in galvanic skin response, which I've measured hundreds of thousands of people, and you find that their baseline variation is like, can be either 0.5 microsiemens or 15 microsiemens or even 20, or is all normal, and yet the direction of their variation always moves in the same direction when they're aroused or whatever. It increases. And so by looking at someone's baseline and saying, how has that changed, you can fundamentally get far more precise measures. I often say, you can't compare the activity levels of a marathon runner and an obese diabetic. They might be the same age, but they're totally different scenarios. So I think that's one, is using people kind of as their own control. Another factor is that you need to, if you think about a lot of the talk about personalized medicine has centered around genomics and mapping individuals' genomes and so forth. But that again is a point in time, and clearly DNA is not the only thing that impacts people. And so you really need to have this ongoing measure somehow. And that's another thing. And I think that's where digital medicine can really come in, is the ongoing continuous monitoring. It helps complete the picture of genomics. And so I think both of those are incredibly important when personalizing medicine.
Jeff, I think you could even go so far as to say that a person has a genotype, but they have many phenotypes. Mm-hmm. Number one is kind of a static picture of how their genes are expressed in ordinary circumstances, but there's also the case of how their genes are expressed when the patient suffers from a disease or condition. And these have very different phenotypic presentations. And those phenotypes are the substance of all the signs and symptoms of disease, many of which go unnoticed because either they aren't measured or they're not measured in the home where this behavior takes place.
I agree with that as well. And I think one of the interesting things, Jeff, that you mentioned about really looking at variation within a subject. within a patient. And that's incredibly useful because, as you quite rightly said earlier, everyone is different. But we need to understand those variances against a possible population. So one of the areas certainly we're investigating at the moment is this concept of not just digitizing people's movements, digitizing and then assessing their condition, but understanding that within a disease trajectory. And so we have this multi-dimensional feature space that might well include those things that Art was just mentioning, those things that aren't typically measured, those things that aren't typically considered. But then that enables us to really understand how individuals are progressing through these disease states. And that's obviously critically important because we want to be preemptive, we want to be prepared for the next stage of the condition, rather than what is often the case in caring for people is we tend to be reactive. We wait until something unpleasant happens, bad test results, and then we put stuff in place. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to make use of this additional information.
Yeah,
I'd also point out, Steve, in your Parkinson's work, there are real practical applications. So let's say you have a patient in a clinical trial. You want to know, are they taking their medicine? In Parkinson's disease, the patient's symptoms and signs on and off are oftentimes part of the study design and maybe even part of the endpoint. So looking at patients' compliance with medication, looking at their on time and off time, looking at the way in which when they're on, the various actigraphy metrics that you look at are affected by the drug, which can speak to safety and efficacy. So there are real practical applications as well as the more philosophical ones about the difference between looking at everything or just looking at one symptom.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of our products does exactly that. It's very difficult to really establish within a 15-minute consultancy with a specialist how things are going. Hence why we measure over 24 hours, 48 hours, and we can see these variations in response to the medication at various points during the day. It really provides a way of being able to understand really the holistic nature of the response of the patient's medication.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I was at a presentation recently where people were actually using a motion detection technology on Parkinson's patients, and they did a power analysis of that versus the UPDRS, the sort of visual or the sort of gold standard measure now, and they found that they could actually reduce the sample size in a clinical trial by an order of magnitude by using this continuous motion analysis. And so, you know, given that, I mean, there's obviously an incredible opportunity here to go from sort of this reactive treatment of acute illness to proactive management of people's health. I think that's, I read another article recently about work done at the Brigham Hospital where they monitored people's sleep over 6 years, actually a little over 6 years. These were elderly people, and they found they could identify based on sleep patterns who was more susceptible to becoming oh gosh, lost the word here. Fragile, not fragile. What is anyway? Basically, the ability to move well. And so anyway, there's a lot of opportunities there. I guess, I'm going to go back to Art and ask, well, so, how is this different, from a physician's point of view, from sort of the normal practice of medicine and normal medical tests, having this continuous flow of information?
Well, There are some very obvious answers. One is the intermittent nature, but it's not the fact that I see you now and I see you in 3 months. It's the fact that I don't see you for 3 months. That's the problem with the practice model. It's not the when I see yous that's the problem. It's the all the time that I don't. And all the time that I don't, you spend in your normal environment doing the things you normally do, your activities of daily living, your sleep cycle, etc. And you know, the definition, this is an FDA definition, but the definition of a biomarker from the FDA is how a patient feels, functions, and survives. And the funny thing is that intermittent doctor visits don't answer any of those questions. Because even if it says how you feel, it's how you feel now, today, this moment. How you function, you can't possibly assess because you've never seen the patient in their own habitat or what they do every day, all day. And even from a survival point of view, it's kind of a moot point. The patient is sitting there looking at you. I guess their survival is unaffected. But if that patient has chronic heart failure, it may turn out that over the next week, continuous data might indicate that the patient is decompensating and in need of hospitalization. So it's not the intermittent nature or the static nature of an image or a blood test. It's all the in-between stuff about feeling and functioning that we don't have. That's the opportunity for digital health technology, and that's what's wrong with the way we've been doing it so far.
Yeah. But I guess I'll follow on. How do doctors manage this? I mean, does this change how they have to manage their patients? Does this change the way they have to think about this instead of ordering a test and getting it back and you're having this very episodic? Now you've got this continuous measure.
Well, this is perhaps not 100% on point, but I think it's a good example. When I was a young doctor in training, there were no blood tests for glucose. Diabetics used to pee on a strip to see if they had excess glucose and ketones in their urine. When they came to the hospital, they had to be subjected to repeated venipunctures to look at their glucose levels. In the 1980s, we developed a home glucose monitor, and that revolutionized things because patients then, in their own environment and doing the things they ordinarily do, like eating what they ordinarily eat, had some insight into how their diabetes was going. That has evolved into the CGM, the continuous glucose monitor. And that has evolved into the CGM tied to an insulin pump in a closed loop fashion. So that is an example of digital technology applied at home, filling in the gaps between illness bouts or doctor visits in such a way that it enables you to care for their disease in a personal way. So that is not, I mean, a wearable CGM certainly is a digital health technology, there's no question. It may not be looking at, sleep or activity or whatever, but what it is doing is it's telling us how the patient is doing between doctor visits or between illness bouts. And that's the example of the way a vacuum can be filled and patient management can improve.
Yeah.
I think one of the other great advantages of this is it means that specialists can use their time more effectively to deal with the more complex cases and to use their experience in a more meaningful way rather than being involved in assessing. In the case of people with Parkinson's, you typically get a 15-minute with a specialist every 6 months. Not very long to really understand what's going on. And if you can relate back to a series of continual measurements that can really present how the patient is coping with the medication and with the condition, then you can spend the time on, as Art was saying, on more personalized aspects.
Stephen, I think you're alluding to something that's even more important, and I know Jeff is a big fan of this and said the patient acts as their own control. It's not just a question of what does the patient look like all the days I don't see him. It's a question of, if I had continuous data, could I see a trend? Could I see a change? Could I see, using the patient as his own control, some change from baseline, either good, bad, or indifferent, but either way, it's information that helps me manage the patient. So the continuous data fills in the gap, but it also provides this tremendous opportunity to compare the patient with how they were before, and to look at trends and to pick up trends long before the next appointment is scheduled.
Yeah, and hence the disease trajectory, because also within Parkinson's and other related conditions, there's some pretty strong evidence that there are subtypes of these conditions and that people will develop in different ways. So yeah, I think the future is very bright in terms of, once we have this information from large populations, we'll be able to really understand better what's happening and how we can expect them to develop and respond.
I mean, this kind of gets to one of my big sort of points that I always refer to. We need more data, and we need it longitudinally on individuals. I mean, it's amazing what you can do. I know that there are rings out there, biometric rings out there, that measure temperature on the finger, which has got to be, your fingers vary in temperature quite a bit, at least mine do. I think pretty much everyone's do. It's maybe one of the worst places on your body to measure temperature, and yet they can actually identify menstrual cycles based on this. The menstrual cycle, the variation in temperature is really quite small. I think it's like 0.5 degrees C, and you have far more variation off your finger. But by collecting lots of data and analyzing it, you can take out sort of the noise and detect extremely small signals, which means, and if you think about that, that's the same with virtually all of the measures we're talking about here, is that given enough data and analysis, you can really make very, very clear distinctions. So long as you use the person as their own control, and you look at variations off their particular baseline. Stephen, maybe you can kind of talk a little bit. You've developed products in this market. In particular, there's, I think, of the levodopa-induced dyskinesia product that you have. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the kinds of analyses that you do in that, and how do you distinguish the levodopa from the induced dyskinesia, from the Parkinson's tremors and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So absolutely, Jeff. So we have a product which we call LID monitor, and this is specifically for people who we know have Parkinson's, but to really understand how effective the medication is to reduce, ameliorate the signs and symptoms of the condition. And one of the problems is that often when somebody with Parkinson's has too much medication, they get uncontrollable involuntary movements that can really affect the quality of life. And these can vary over 24 hours. They can have peaks and troughs, as the cocktail of medications that some with Parkinson's will often take vary. They wear off and when they're taken. And so there are a number of challenges here in being able to really identify what is a side effect of the medication and what is otherwise just a natural activity within a daily living. So, for example, is it really too much medication that's causing these uncontrollable movements, or is it that the person happens to be doing some gym exercises or washing up or typing or something like that? So the way about this was really to video many people with Parkinson's under different medications, and then to have specialists rate these. And it was through this data set, this label data set, we were then able to train algorithms to discriminate between those movements which are a cause of the side effect of medication, as opposed to those that are just from normal daily activities. So that might sound reasonably straightforward, but there are many potential complications there. It's very much like when we look at other real-world applications of AI, like in driverless cars or other things. They're what we call these edge cases, these difficult cases when we're looking at data on the edge, something that the algorithms probably haven't seen enough before. And so it's really ensuring that the algorithms we develop generalize well enough to be able to analyze the full breadth of data that we're going to be encountering from different patients in different conditions. So there's quite a bit of work there to ensure the efficacy of the work we undertake. And that's compounded by the fact that the gold standard for these conditions, the Unified Dyskinesia Rating Scale, as it's known formally, is really assessed by clinical specialists through observation. So inherently, that subjective assessment is ultimately going to have some concerns about its reliability. So we have a number of things to worry about. One is the breadth of data, how representative the data is, and also taking account for some possible labeling errors as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and you raised the point of the challenge of dealing with a system where the gold standard is actually far less accurate and good than the data that you're providing or that you're seeking to provide, and how do you validate it and do it? I mean, the standard joke with polysomnography used to measure sleep is that it's the most accurate way to measure the way no one sleeps, and so, you know, Art, do you have any thoughts about how you deal with this problem where you're actually, the things that you're measuring are so, you know, much better than you know, the things you're trying to validate against?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think are important to point out. The first one is that some things, like how we feel, function, and survive, are applicable to any and all people and any and all diseases. So let's take something very simple like step count. Do you think step count is useful in Parkinson's? Well, of course it is, because slowness of movement, what we call bradykinesia or shuffling gait, is part and parcel of the standard symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But is a step count useful in heart failure? The answer is yes. Is it useful in the recuperation after total knee replacement? The answer is yes. So we have one digital metric which has utility across very diverse disease sets, but there's nothing specific about a step count. Conversely, we could do what Stephen is doing, where he's saying, you know what, this dyskinesia thing only occurs in Parkinson's disease patients with too much levodopa. I want to find something and measure it that is disease specific. So we have two real opportunities in digital medicine. One is to do what Stephen is doing, which is to become specific in our ability to objectively, even quantitatively, detect and measure things that are disease specific, such as dyskinesias in Parkinson's. The other opportunity we have is to use something that's generic about feeling and functioning and surviving, but put it in a clinical context of use and say, I'm looking at step count, not in anybody, in heart failure? And how does that actually correlate with the need for rehospitalization or early mortality or medication success, et cetera? So these are two different ways in which digital technologies can both personalize medicine and improve the care model. But taking the generic things like sleeping, activity, step counts, and putting them in a clinical context of use, and then going through clinical validation of them, that is the way forward. So that practitioners can then say, you know what, I just discharged my patient from the hospital with heart failure. They're looking pretty good, but I'm going to monitor them with this because now I know this will tell me whether they are staying compensated or may need to be seen.
Thanks. I mean, I guess, I mean, there are a number of ways I'd love to follow up on that. You know, one is just, you know, talking about step count, because, you know, clearly you use different devices and even different versions of the same device, and you come up with different step counts. As, again, another of my soapboxes where I, you know, we need to somehow standardize those metrics. And so that if someone's talking about a step count, I don't particularly like step count, I have to admit, as a metric, but it's familiar to people, so there's value in that. But at least standardize it so that we know we're talking about the same thing, because otherwise we can never combine data from one study to another, one device to another, because they're different metrics, and you don't know how they're different is a big challenge. But I think that, well, I guess I'll turn that back to you guys. I mean, do you think that there is value in standardizing metrics? I mean, it would seem to me that caregivers need to be able to understand the metrics that they are working with, and having a different metric for every different device seems a little crazy to me. I mean, what do you think?
I would say it's a problem as old as the hill. So you could take something just like taking a pulse rate. I mean, some work we've done recently, we've been looking at measuring heart rate of infants. And it's kind of interesting, really, because you would think that measuring a heart rate is pretty easy. You measure an ECG, you look at the peaks, all sorts of problems start occurring. And so, yeah, you could try and standardize. But even when we look at simple things like heart rate or measuring other things, there could be a lot of reasons behind it. My inclination would be to go for as much data as possible, and then effectively take multimodal data and then extract the type of information that you require. I think if you try and tie down too much to a particular way of doing something, you're always going to come across challenges. I don't know, Jeff. I think it's a really good point. I don't know the answer. What I do know is that within, again, taking the example of Parkinson's disease, one of the most common tests that probably people might be familiar with if they've been assessed for Parkinson's is a very simple finger tapping test. So you're asked just to tap your finger and thumb together as quickly and as widely as you can. Hopefully, Art, that's looking okay from what you can see. But and that sounds pretty straightforward. And so what we do, we have sensors on the finger and thumb, and so we can measure in real time the movement of those. And you think, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. But actually, when you say as widely and as quickly as possible, is the target opening or is the target closing? Some people do finger tapping up here, some people down here. It's a real minefield trying to standardize these things. So my feeling and my experience over all the years of measuring people is that the less you try and constrain the activity, probably the more utility you get from that.
It's very interesting. I participated in a study where we used very sensitive accelerometers and measured the dominant frequency of Parkinson's patients in terms of their resting tremor. And what was interesting is not only did everybody fall generally between about 4 and 8 hertz, but they frequently had harmonic overtones. And then when you saw them take their medication, the power spectrum, even at the dominant frequency, was reduced, and the the overtones, harmonic overtones, disappeared. That is in the UPDRS. And that's something, I don't care who you are as a clinician, you can't see that with the naked eye. So there is an opportunity in digital health technology to be much more precise, quantitative, and accurate in the assessment of a patient's condition over the so-called gold standard like the UPDRS, which is entirely subjective. The second thing I would say is that I think it's unfortunate that certain consumer products are as popular as they are because they're popular because they're popular. They're not popular because they're accurate. It's more like they're assumed to be accurate because they're popular. Like, honestly, I'm sure that the VeraSense research sensor is a better indication of patients' activity levels and step counts than an Apple Watch. Unfortunately, Apple Watches are popular and consumer grade, and if you want compliance, people may be attracted by the brand name rather than by the accuracy of the data that they report. The third thing I would say about this is that in medicine in general, it's kind of let the punishment fit the crime. If I'm just coming in for a routine physical, some healthcare person will come in and take my blood pressure. If I'm in an emergency room, they may put what's called a Dynamap, an automatic blood pressure thing, and it'll take it every 10 minutes. If I get admitted to the ICU or the operating room, I may find myself with a catheter in my radial artery, and we're measuring blood pressure right off the intra-arterial pressure. And if you come to my intensive care unit and you're in shock, you're going to get a 16-gauge catheter up your femoral artery into your central aorta because shock has a substantial mortality, 40% and above, and we're not going to mess around with anything less than central aortic pressure to make sure that the patient has life-sustaining perfusion. Now, not everybody needs an aortic catheter at home, but the question is, what do you need? You know, and I would echo what Jeff is asking for, which is there should be some standard that says you have to be accurate compared to a gold standard, plus or minus this, in order to be medically used or clinically used or in clinical development used to produce the outcome. And the last thing I'd say is to contradict myself completely. The truth of the matter is trend is what really matters. So even if your Apple Watch isn't accurate, it's still your Apple Watch. And if you were taking 8,000 steps last month and this month you're taking 5,000, the question is what happened? It's not what about your step count, it's what's going on with you, because the way you're functioning seems to have changed.
Yeah. No. So I absolutely agree. I think that generally a lot of these metrics are going to be very highly correlated, and the you know, if you have the same, if you're measuring the same step count, then it's the trend that matters. The reason that the VeraSense watches and so forth are generally superior to any of the consumer devices actually has less to do about the sensors themselves and much more to do about the availability of the actual sensor data. So all these watches calculate, you know, step count based on 3-axis accelerometers. But then as soon as they convert it to step count, they delete all that data, and you're left with, steps per hour or steps per day or whatever, and huge amounts of information is lost then. And what's more, if someone changes the version of their watch, suddenly you may get this, immediate discontinuous change in their step counts, not because they've changed, it's because the algorithm that's processing them changes. And that's why I think it's so important to actually drive and focus on the basic raw data that the sensors generate, and then try and standardize the algorithms based on that translate that into something that's sort of physically meaningful to people. I guess the other part of the whole issue with an Apple Watch or whatever is that in fact you your step count is maybe an okay measure of activity, but it's never going to measure Parkinson's tremors. Kind of going back there, and so now you need a different watch for that, and so forth. So I think that's really in my feeling, the difference between sort of the clinical quality stuff and the consumer stuff. They know how, people have known how to make these chips for over 30 years. All the chips, some are better than others. There's no question about that. But the difference is really at the level we're talking about are truly marginal. It's what happens to that data once you've got that data, where does it go and how is it processed? And that has huge differences. I mean, Stephen, you obviously know a bit about actually using devices. Is that your experience too, or is that?
Yeah, very, very much so, Jeff. I mean, so yeah, I've been using digitizing devices long ago, since when I was doing my first degrees. But what's kind of interesting, so another device comes along, the data is slightly different, the way it's reported, often an improvement, bigger fidelity of data is coming through, higher resolution. But that can often present more problems than it solves. And I suppose that then comes on to an approach we've taken, which I think was mentioned in the description, of how we've always tried to focus on analysis and machine learning approaches, which we call white box. In other words, what we mean by white box is that you can see into the working of the machine learning algorithm, or to be precise, that when we generate a classifier, when we produce a classifier, we can describe that classifier as a discrete mathematical expression. And what that means is we can tell you exactly how the data from the device has been manipulated to arrive at the classification, i.e., do you have Parkinson's or not? What degree of sign or symptom do you have? And I personally believe there's a lot of value in that, because when we are talking about different types of devices, when we are looking at different conditions, then we can get a better understanding of what's actually happening to the data through the manipulation phase.
Yeah. So I want to try and step back now. I looked at the time and realized that we're closing in on the end here. Let's sort of, what are the implications of all the stuff we've been talking about? I mean, what do we think are the sort of the key success factors in implementing digital health technologies and personalizing medicine?
Well, think about this. How is anything that we use diagnostically or therapeutically brought to market? So let's say we have a new drug for Parkinson's, and it's based on good molecular science and good clinical science, and then we have a candidate molecule, and then we go through phases 1, 2, 3, and we show safety and effectiveness, and the drug is approved. Now that happens less than 20% of the time, but that notwithstanding, that's how it gets into clinical practice. And then a patient with Parkinson's comes into their doctor and says, I heard there's a new treatment for Parkinson's. And the doctor says, yes, and you'd be a wonderful candidate. So 10 years earlier, basic science suggested a molecule, and now 10 years later and $2 billion, there's a drug on the market. And so it's adopted. And if we're lucky, it's reimbursed by insurance companies and people can benefit. Why hasn't that happened with digital endpoints? It's been shown ad nauseum in the academic research that digital monitoring, remote patient monitoring, actigraphy, sleep monitoring, vital signs, heart rate variability, all kinds of things can affect outcome, can improve the N required for a given clinical trial, can distinguish between patients who are taking the medicine and not taking the medicine. I mean, all of that utility, you'd think that there would be a process by which the FDA or some other sanctioning agency would say, from now on, this is how we're going to measure effectiveness of heart failure drugs. And yet that hasn't happened. Only one time has a digital endpoint been officially sanctioned by a regulatory agency, and that was in the EU, where the EMA approved stride velocity 95th percentile for patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But what we need to do is get people interested in having not just the academic publication, but the recognition from regulatory agencies that says, okay, so you showed, you can tell who needs to be readmitted. Let's make it official. And the next time we do a trial, we have to include this. But we are stuck on that step, the step of validating in the clinical context of use, so-called V3 process, which is another webinar, but that's where we're stuck right now.
Yeah. Stephen, you have any comments on this, or?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we're still in those early Wild West stages of so many people working with so many different types of wearables, and it's just taking time, I think, to to really really bring us something that will be well recognized, well proven. Just takes time, I think, and the technology's developing all the time as well. So we're in very interesting times. I think there's huge opportunities.
Yeah, no, there's definitely huge opportunities. I guess I'm personally frustrated that, you know, the basic sensors have been around for 30 years. Yeah, so we've got, I think there are now two digital endpoints accepted. There was one accepted by the FDA. It's change in daily activity. Unfortunately, the drug that it was accepted for failed the test. So they didn't. It's not publicized nearly so much as the Duchenne's drug. Yeah, I think, you know, a couple of things that have sort of occurred to me as we've been talking is that we need to start thinking very differently about what we're doing, and I guess I would I have some of my thoughts are, first of all, we need to be a lot more systematic about collecting data and aggregating it, and because we're dealing in real world effects, it's not as clean as these academic studies. So we need to start putting that together. I also think that there will need to be a paradigm shift in how healthcare is provided, at least in the United States and probably worldwide. If you're talking about doing things like preventing and managing people's health proactively, now you're monitoring people who are currently healthy. I don't know of anyone who reimburses that right now, and so we need to think about how that changes, how doctors imagine this, and so I do think there's some work to be done there, and I think collaboration is very important. I don't know if I haven't seen any questions popping up because we've been answering everything as we go along. So maybe Stephen, we'll start with you. Sort of any sort of closing takeaways that you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, yes, thanks, Jeff. One that I've learned the hard way over many years, and that is for any engineers, practitioners out there in data analysis, really understanding the clinical context, understanding the needs of all the stakeholders, the medics, the patients, the patient carers. So important. We really need to understand what we're trying to do, what it's for, and what we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Great. Art, anything on your side?
Well, I think that I'm still having the same epiphanies. I think every disease turns out to be a systemic disease and should be evaluated systemically. We don't just ask the question, does your knee hurt? We ask the question, does it get in the way of you moving around? Does it get in the way of you sleeping? Does it get in the way of you doing activities of daily living? So I think that lesson learned is very real. I think the other lesson learned is it's not, what's wrong with the system is not that I don't see you for 3 months. It's that I don't see anything that happens during those 3 months. And that's the opportunity for remote patient monitoring. And that can have these two flavors. One is contextualized, like step count's important to everybody, but in different ways. Or it could be disease specific for a change, like the detection of dyskinesias, like in Stephen's work. So we have tremendous opportunities there. I think the world needs to settle in on fewer technologies than are currently available, settle in on some standards of what their performance is and what particular biometrics and digital biomarkers they can produce, and then get serious about applying them, not just in clinical development where 100 people get this, but in clinical practice. And that's where the bugaboo is going to be with regard to financing, but that again is another webinar.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess I will just kind of close and say, I think, the sort of the key takeaways I'd like the group to have is, one is that you need to use people as their own control. You need to baseline people against themselves and look for change. And I think that implies that you need to collect longitudinal data. And I guess the other thing is we have this issue with the gold standard of the current measurements are less accurate potentially than what we're doing. So I think we need to start connecting our digital health data directly with outcomes, as opposed to going through an intermediate step of measuring something that we can measure elsewhere. And so if you kind of put all this together, it means that we've got to collect a lot of data, and that we need to it needs to be done systematically. I think we need to start reusing the data that we collect. So having data warehouse is important. And I don't think any organization can do this on their own. I think we need pre-competitive collaboration. And I know there are a lot of other people who believe that, but I think we just need to start doing it.
Well, thank you all very much for that insightful presentation. If you'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event, and a survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. And additionally, there's a link to view the recording of this event, which you can also share with your colleagues so they may register here as well. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Dr. Arthur Combs, Dr. Stephen Smith, and Jeff Gill. We hope you found this webinar informative, and have a great day, everyone.
Great.